Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hay. Those of you who aren't from Hay, thank you for coming to the festival. Those who are, particular thank you to whoever it was who brought the weather with them this morning. My name is Bullough. I write about Russia and the former Soviet Union, and I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to talk to Sigrid Rausing. Actually, I've forgotten a copy of her book, which is out there. Miriam, could you bring me my copy of the book, please? Sorry. It's not very professional. I thought coming out, my God, Sigrid's left her book behind. Everything is Wonderful, a memoir of a collective farm in Estonia. And before we begin, I should say this event is part of the Barclays Business Leadership Series. There are a number of them throughout the week, and I recommend them all, obviously. I think the way we're going to begin is Sigrid is going to read a short passage from the beginning of the book, which sets up the discussion we're going to have about what on earth she was doing on a collective farm in Estonia in 1993.
Thank you. I travelled across on the ferry to Tallinn, Estonia's capital, from Stockholm, as I had done many times before. I drove straight down to the collective farm. I should say this is when I first come to the collective farm in the summer of '93. It was a sunny day with a strange clarity of light. I drove west from Tallinn, past the small settlements of Keila, then Mumu, and a ruined monastery. I remember birds singing and crossing a stream of brown water. The light shimmered strangely. There were mirages over the pockmarked tarmac. A rooster crowed in the silence between a few thundering lorries on the otherwise empty road. There was a hallucinatory quality to that drive. The loose flap of a lorry canvas in front of me seemed like an ominous message, the landscape drenched with meaning and expectation. I see now, so many years later, how alone I was and how apprehensive. The land on both sides of the narrow road into the peninsula was marshy. You could see that this had once been an island, or even several islands. I drove past some old grey houses with frayed thatched roofs and shoddy white brick additions, past the abandoned Soviet watchtower and barrier, now permanently propped open. I stopped at a church built where the marsh ended. In the spring it had been locked up in a state of disrepair. Now it was open, with newly painted grey benches, broad flagstones on the floor, spare and Lutheran. Instead of driving towards Pirksi, the village where I was to live, I took another road towards the sea, delaying the moment of arrival. It was a wide dirt road, and I drove on for miles. Outside each farm stood a wooden stand for the milk cans, although the dairy collections, I knew, had ceased for the time being, along with so much else. At the end of the road, by the sea, was a single abandoned white brick building, perhaps a family house, in that Soviet state of dilapidation that could signify incompletion or abandonment, or perhaps both. An open door was banging in the wind, and you could hear the waves.
Now, Sigrid Rausing, for those of you who don't know, is the publisher of Granta, the publisher of Granta, the editor of Granta magazine, a philanthropist, and not necessarily the kind of person you would have expected to find on an Estonian collective farm in 1993. So, Sigrid, could we begin by you telling us why you were there? What was going on in that ruined country at that particularly grim time?
So I was there to do my fieldwork for a PhD. I'd started my PhD at University College London. I was going to write about Melanesian systems of law, and custom law, and how notions of tradition and history were incorporated into custom law. I mentioned that because it had a bearing on what I then decided to do. 1989 happened, and I became very interested in the very small field of post-Soviet anthropology and the ways in which minorities within the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, connected with their pre-Soviet identities to form new post-Soviet, and in the case of Estonia, independent identities. So I first visited in 91, a couple of times, and then I came back to do my fieldwork in 93. And I was there in the, it was that autumn that there was a coup against Yeltsin by Kasparov and others. And, the nationalist communist coup against the extreme austerity policies of Yeltsin. That ultimately was unsuccessful because the army took Yeltsin's side. And I was in a former border protection zone, so it was a very remote and isolated area, even within Estonia itself. And you really could sense the austerity policies. There was little heating, even less hot water. The dining room had been closed down, the creche had been closed down. There was inflation was running at about 50%. At the same time, people's savings had been decimated by the currency reforms. So it was a very tough time for the Estonians, and particularly since this was it was very much an economic experiment. And so they could have no sense of how long this was going to last. People had no idea that within a few years, because it was quite quick in Estonia, within a few years, wages would go up and people's living standards would improve enormously. But that wasn't at all clear at that time.
Should be said, just in case anyone's geography is a little bit hazy, Estonia is one of the 3 Baltic states that was part of the Soviet Union or was occupied by the Soviet Union, depending on who you believe. It's now part of the EU, and now it's considered, I think, quite a success story for development in Eastern Europe. But at the time, as you say, things were pretty grim, and they were particularly grim in this part of Estonia where you were. Even by Estonian standards, this was a bad bit. And it wasn't just any old bit of Estonia, was it? It had a very interesting history.
Yeah, so one of the reasons this was a particularly poor area of Estonia was because there was a minority in Estonia of Swedish people. And that minority, about 8,000 people, which sounds like very little to us, but in Estonian terms was quite a sizable minority who lived on the west coast and on the islands, were evacuated en masse by the SS in 1944, which was obviously an enormously tainting evacuation for the Swedes, who, in Sweden. And so they came to Sweden, were told to never talk about it. This happened weeks before the Soviet forces were coming back to reoccupy Estonia. And so the population on the collective farm, which, collective farm isn't what we think of as a farm. It's all the villages on the peninsula were part of the collective farm. It had originally been lots of small collective farms, but then they all amalgamated until only the Lenin collective farm was the one left, And so the population just simply never recovered from that, and from the war itself. A quarter of Estonia's population disappeared in connection with the war, the deportations, the occupations.
But your family is originally from Sweden,
Yep.
And so you clearly felt a connection to these Swedes, possibly mythical Swedes, if there were any left, in this part of Estonia.
Yeah, I didn't think I would feel such a strong connection as I did. I didn't go there because I felt the connection. I went simply because I knew Swedish. It was the first minority in the Soviet Union to have its own association, so it was kind of in advance of the other minorities that came later. And so that was an interesting part of it. But as time went on, I found it very poignant, meeting the old Swedes who were still left, who were struggling to find their Swedish words, as I was struggling to find Swedish words too, because I live in English and, they live in Estonian. And so I felt such a strong sense of kinship with them.
And that your supervisor described, I thought I rather like this, the goal of field work, he said, was it You seek to comprehend both yourself, your own society, and the society you are studying in one movement. That is a seriously ambitious thing to try and do.
Yeah.
You know, what mechanism, how do you do that? I mean, you know, what does that involve?
Well, so you do it through fieldwork, and the idea of fieldwork is participant observation. So you live and work alongside the people you're studying. And you are recording pretty much every single conversation you have. Every conversation adds to your analysis of the society. And so it's rather like psychoanalysis in that, you know, it's the stray comments, it's the jokes that you take seriously as kind of slips from the cultural unconscious, if you like. That's not quite language anthropologists use. But I mean, nevertheless, that's what you do.
And presumably most of these jokes were being made in Estonian.
Yeah.
Is that like Swedish?
No. Estonian is like Finnish.
And how is that?
Finno-Ugric. It's not an Indo-European language. So, and I never learned to speak it fluently, I should say. So my fieldwork took place in a bit of Estonian, a bit of German, a bit of Swedish, a bit of English.
So you were in a ruined collective farm in a particularly poor part of, at that time, an extremely impoverished country, trying to work in a language that you spoke imperfectly.
Yes.
This is a seriously uphill struggle. There's a moment in the book when you meet a Peace Corps volunteer who tells you, almost by way of a greeting, that she'd cried every day for the previous year.
Yeah.
I mean, this sounds like lunacy to me.
See, she was from Alabama, and you know, Alabama obviously was kind of a very friendly country, and Estonians are very remote, and they don't necessarily welcome you. So she'd had a year where pretty much nobody had invited her for anything or even said hello to her. But being Swedish, I understood all that much better. I understood what it meant, and I understood what it didn't mean. I mean, she thought of it as an active hostility towards her in the beginning, and it kind of wore her down. I didn't feel that.
But nonetheless, this was an extreme existence that you were living. I mean, I believe the hot water went off within a couple of weeks and didn't come back on until the spring.
Yeah.
I mean, that, you know, working in those conditions, that must be very hard.
Yeah, but then I was comparing myself to colleagues of mine who were in, you know, in places like the Ethiopian highlands, living in mud huts for 2 years, you know. So in those comparative terms, it wasn't particularly harsh.
But so this is it's interesting. Is that it's a bit of Europe, so it looks like Europe and it feels like Europe, but at the same time, it isn't the Europe that we recognise. And there's this moment when you're talking about what you call the secret language of things. So virtually everybody in the village wore clothes donated from Sweden. I had grown up amongst those jeans and T-shirts and jackets and boots. They were part of my memories. I'd left Sweden 13 years before I came to the collective farm, and the donated clothes seemed to belong to my teenage years. I saw a woman in Sami boots. In 1970s Sweden, those boots signalled prog music, vegetarianism, ecology, and anti-imperialism. And this, you know, it is, you presumably had to unlearn an awful lot of things that you thought of about what was European in order to learn what was happening in Estonia.
I mean, I don't know about that, because my concept of Europe was already so sort of firmly anchored in Northern Europe, I mean, very much despite myself. But I felt, you know, most people go to a field site and then they kind of slowly kind of get to know it and they kind of assimilate themselves to the field site. And I had the experience of being on a field site where everybody collectively in the village were assimilating themselves to my culture, not only to my culture, but to a culture that I had left 13 years previously. And so suddenly, because it wasn't quite like that in the beginning, it was kind of more and more the case that they were all wearing Swedish clothes. And they all had empty bottles of Swedish shampoo as decorations in the bathrooms, So all the little markers and signs from Sweden specifically, because there was a twin town agreement with a Swedish town, were kind of trickling in. I mean, including Swedish signs in the shop in the village. Suddenly had an ICA sign, which is a big Swedish food chain. For this basically tiny post-Soviet store. So there was something very surreal and dreamlike about those signs and seeing it.
But it does. As the book goes on, your existence does become increasingly weird. And there's a lady I'd like you to talk a little bit about who I think she was a Seventh-day Adventist.
Yes.
And she wrote English, didn't she? But not
Yes.
really English as anyone else writes it. Could you talk a little bit about her?
Yeah, Ruth. She was 76 when I knew her. She's dead now. And she was a Seventh-day Adventist. She was extremely religious. I mean, madly religious, actually. She was right on the borderline between religion and madness, particularly in such a very, very atheist environment. And she had been married to the vice boss of the collective farm, but she'd also been subject to various forms of repression in the Stalinist era. And one of the things I write about in the book, incidentally, is that for the people on the collective farm, the division they made wasn't between communism and post-communism. It was between Stalinism and post-Stalinism, because the quality of the Stalinist repression was so intense and so dangerous compared to what came afterwards. And so she had been arrested several times and spent time in a re-education camp, and various awful things had happened to her. Her husband had beaten her. He was an alcoholic. And when I met her, she'd escaped into the world of religion, and she gave me 2 historical documents. We spoke mainly German, which I don't speak very well, but she spoke quite well. So she wrote these documents for me in English, and she had looked up every word. So they became these beautiful, poetic documents.
Can you read a paragraph?
I can. I had to fight to keep them in. The editors wanted to take them out, but this is how it begins. I begin to write over Paskleb, that was the area. Devilish age, sad age, school children also spies. Sky was as night, earth as giddiness, deceit, fraud, life as leprosy. Communists live royally, work women, people, must live as deaf and dumb. Wherever seen, wrong, evil, crime, underfed, always naked, footwear old, rubbers broken, cold habit, children only home.
So this it gets to I think the core of what I think was peculiar about what you were doing, since you're living and doing field work as opposed to just living somewhere and having friends, is that you have to talk to everyone, whether or not they are like Ruth, though no doubt a very interesting person, also probably a profoundly disturbing person to spend a long time with. There's a description when you say you got ill, and you say this was either the low point of my fieldwork or a brief return to sanity from the practice of anthropological fieldwork. Yeah. It's almost like you thought you feel you've gone mad sort of while doing fieldwork because it's so intense. So how do you hang on to your own sense of yourself while opening yourself so totally to something like this?
Well, I think, there was a kind of hallucinatory quality to a lot of my time there, and there was a kind of slight sense of madness about it, which, I remember one time I describe it in the book. I went for a walk, and my walks were always, what saved me, it's kind of rambling for hours in the forest, and it was snow, and I looked at my own footsteps coming back, and they looked so firm, and I look at the way the footsteps point slightly outwards, and they're very firmly imprinted in the ground, and I try to keep up coming back, and I can't quite keep up, and I felt very much split into two beings at that point.
And you were living with a local family, and the father of the house was an alcoholic. So you didn't really have a refuge at home either.
No.
Could you talk about alcoholism a little bit and how, I mean, it's clearly a major issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. I was not unfamiliar with addiction, as you can imagine, perhaps. And so here I ended up in this family where the husband was an alcoholic, a periodic drinker. But not a violent drinker, but a maudlin drinker. And when he drank, his wife quite often left and took the children. And so I was alone with this man who was kind of big, bear-like man who would sit at the kitchen table and weep, and show me things from his past. And, I genuinely felt very empathetic towards him because he was like many alcoholics, he had an interesting mind too, But that terrible self-pity was eating him up,
And you say that for people it was totally ordinary that there was just two scales of pay. If someone was an alcoholic,
Yeah.
they got paid less than a non-alcoholic,
Yeah.
and that was just accepted.
The village was completely divided in terms of the workmen, in terms of who was an alcoholic and who was not an alcoholic, and the alcoholics were paid better. And everybody took that for granted.
So this is essentially a society that by Soviet occupation, Nazi occupation, Soviet reoccupation, and then a long period of Soviet rule has been totally shattered. And is just only now trying to pick up the pieces and become, as it were, Swedish.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you picked, as it were, though it sounds awful, you picked an amazing time to be there.
It was an amazing time to be there, and it's gone now, because Estonia has been so very good at memorializing and so very good at, writing and thinking about history. But when I was there, nobody knew the history. Nobody knew the history, particularly of the independence era between the wars. Estonia was independent from 1918 when it declared independence. Then it had to fight the war against the Soviet Union for independence, which succeeded in the Peace of Tartu in 1920. Until the first occupation in 1941. And until from 1920 to 1934, Estonia was a democracy. And very much in the spirit of President Wilson, it was about minority rights, it was about democracy, and there was a thriving civil society, and not least for the Swedish Estonians, but for all Estonians. But the Estonian Swedes got a lot of help from Sweden. They were very investigated in various ways from Sweden. Journalists were coming, tourists were coming, missionaries were coming, and there were Swedish schools and Swedish journals and various societies and all. So all of that was happening. All of that was destroyed in the occupations and in the war. And so they think about 200,000 books, all in all, were destroyed from the main libraries in Tallinn and in Tartu. A quarter of the population had disappeared by the end of the war. The entire intelligentsia was decimated, and not just by the Soviet occupation, but also by the Nazi occupation. So that double occupation meant that more than for Russia, that there was nothing left of the intelligentsia, independent publishing, all the professions. It was just in pieces. And so there was no shared historical framework anymore to hang people's own memories of their own lives on.
I think it'd be nice if you could do this brief reading from page 156. I think this lack of past is what gives one of the reasons why your book has this very strange hallucinatory quality, and I think this is wonderful. This passage, I think, sort of conveys that better than any other.
The light was intense, almost a pure white. This is now spring. There were flowers and greenery all around. Already I missed the bleakness of early spring, the sketchy silhouettes of the trees against twilight evenings, the pallor and fragility of the April light. That evening I went for a walk late in the evening, after 11, and it was still dusky, with the remains of a pale orange sunset, the moon a full quarter by the evening star, a mist over the low-lying fields. Standing on the road, listening to the cacophony of birds, echoing like in a jungle, thinking about the sound of dinosaur worlds, a stork flew past me on its way to the nest on the chimney of the old dairy. That night I had a dream. I was walking on a savanna at sunset. It was improbably beautiful, as though dusted with gold. I was watching a pair of eagles slowly circling in the sky. I knew they were enormously rare. I saw them descend towards the pit, their home, and I walked towards them. 2 British bird watchers were hiding nearby, wiry and bespectacled observers with binoculars. They beckoned me over, whispering that I had to be very quiet. The 2 birds were standing now. They hadn't seen us. I was struck by their ordinariness. They were bird people, but the bird woman's hair was bleached and permed, forming a strange contrast to the extraordinary beauty and exoticism of the vision of them slowly circling. It was a man and a woman, and they had human bodies, naked, with eagle wings folded, but also tied on behind their arms. They were a parallel species, not quite human. It struck me that this dream was about my fieldwork, the grandeur of the theoretical framework, the extraordinary beauty of the country, the spectators with their lenses, the levels of theoretical interpretation, and the ordinary poverty of life in the village. After no BBC World Service for 8 months, I turned the radio on to hear a snatch of dialogue. "And how much does one of these cost?" £5. "And it's small enough to carry away in a pocket, isn't it?" "Yes, it is." And then the voices faded out again. From my window I could see small children playing by themselves in the yard, unaware of being observed, leaning on the swing, investigating the ground, turning and trotting down the little path that cut off a corner of the grassy patch. The swallows and house martins dived and played in the wind. A door banged. A draft moved through the room.
So it's extraordinary because you entered this peculiar sort of liminal state for a year, but obviously the people there, they lived in this peculiar pastless experience. And you have this very interesting moment when you were talking about the wreck of the ferry Estonia, which sank in a storm with hundreds of people died, and a documentary that was made about it, in which the Swedes who survived were able to very precisely convey the narrative of what happened to them. But the Estonians weren't. They just couldn't make a clear progression of the events. And it was almost like by being denied a narrative of their own past, because the Soviets' version had been so imposed upon them, that they'd essentially become incapable of conveying their own history. And there's a moment when you compare this to the proles in 1984 and how they were denied anything. And you say was that the stories of the people I met were not shored up by official and public versions of events, nor told sufficiently often to have created fluency and certainty. They just about knew what had happened, but they had no proper context for the story yet. Like Winston's proles, they couldn't give coherent answers. And that seems to me to be the message of your book. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's, because this essentially is a book about tyrannies and the destruction of history and what happens to the people who live in the aftermath of that. And they don't even really know it. They have such vague ideas about it, and they're looking forward. We're so used to thinking about catastrophe as being in the future, but in this situation, catastrophe was in the past. It really happened, and it was catastrophic, and the people still then were survivors, and they didn't. Yeah, as I said before, they didn't know, and I thought I thought Orwell, an idea of, the proles, Winston going to the pub, and the proles not remembering anything other than stray events was so apt. It was a very apt analogy for it, because as I said before, the thing that they lacked was history, historical frameworks, journalistic frameworks, sociology, so they couldn't hang their memories on anything other than, what they individually remembered.
I mean, it's an astonishingly gentle book, and you very much allow your conclusions to reveal themselves rather than forcing them upon the reader. But do you think, I'm sort of slightly asking you to not do that, do you think that, this is a success of the Soviet Union? Do you think they successfully erased these people's pasts? Did it work? Is this a way that you can re-engineer society like they said they were trying to do?
Yeah, and they didn't particularly set out to, the Soviet Union didn't set out to erase memories, I think. What they had created was a system where it was literally dangerous to come from a slightly better off background or professional background, and so people didn't transmit the memories down the generations. People were very careful, and so that was a very important part of it, and as important, I think, as the fact that the history that was taught in school was very heavily censored, and in the Estonian context, what they had learned about the interwar years was very much about the authoritarian regime that President Pats instigated in after 1934, when there was a right-wing coup, and so that's what I learned about.
And so, I'm just tying together the two halves of it. You have a society which has had its collective idea of itself re-engineered, and a society that is also deeply, clearly dysfunctional with major addiction problems, poverty problems. It's struggling to come to terms with anything. Do you think that as it were, one leads to the other? Was the engineering to blame for the alcoholism, do you think, or were they just two separate factors that happened to exist side by side?
I think that, as you know better than me, the whole of the Soviet Union became an alcoholic society. We've just published a book, which is a kind of surreal road trip through the Kolyma Peninsula by a Polish journalist called Hugo Jacek-Bader.
It's very good.
Thank you. And he describes a society which is even more post-traumatic than the society I describe, and everybody drinks, and they are drinking themselves to death, It's become a social disease. Like suicide, alcoholism is socially contagious. It becomes normal. It's normal to drink vodka. It's normal to start the day with 50 grams of vodka. Not anymore, though. On my collective farm, it was normal to drink alcohol with ethanols. It's medical spirits,
right?
As well as vodka.
But it was a cocktail.
It was a cocktail, yeah.
Ethanol and vodka.
No, ethanol and sweet fruit juices.
And so obviously the situation in Russia, sadly, I only say because this is something I've written about as well, is sadly unchanged. It continues in that way. But you have been back to Estonia, haven't you, since this has happened, and caught up with some of the people you wrote about.
Yeah.
And actually, it's sort of it's kind of a happy ending in a way.
It's a happy ending. I went back in 2004, and the first thing we saw entering the village was a big painted graffiti on the rusty workshop wall. And that graffiti made the village look even poorer than it was when I was there 10 years earlier. But in fact, the graffiti was a student project from the school, and they wanted to warm the village up. And
so this wasn't a sign of gang culture
running
rampant.
And I should say, one of the things about the culture of the collective farm was that when I was there, was that it was incredibly safe. There was no crime. and people's idea of security was locking their doors but leaving the key in the door. That was their concession to the new, what they saw as the new crime-filled Estonia, you know. So it was extreme poverty, but it was also poverty which was utterly unpolarized. I mean, you know, pretty much everybody had, you know, they didn't have anything and nobody had anything. You know, there were 2 new houses that were slightly better than the others, and one was the mayor's house, and the other one was for the builder who built both of them. You know, and that was the degree of polarization. And so, you know, there was no crime, there was no polarization, there were no drugs. You know, so everything that we associate with poverty and marginalization, you know, strong police presence, quite a violent police presence, polarization, drugs, gangs, none of that existed on the collective farm.
And so, in a way, although they have clearly gained things now, materially speaking, and with the knowledge of their own history, in a way they've lost something too.
Well, I don't think I would go as far as that.
Okay.
I think it's a much, much happier country. I think it was a deeply unhappy country.
And how did because this isn't, as I said, this isn't the first thing you've written about this. I mean, you also wrote your PhD and an academic book as well about the same fieldwork, from taking a very sort of a more academic approach. How have they reacted to having themselves described in this way? I'm interested in the, you know, I'm interested in what the anthropologized thinks about the anthropologist.
I know, and it's a terrible thing to be written about. It's, you know, it's a deeply awful thing to look into that distorting mirror and to be objectified in that way. But I had 3 emails from people on the collective farm, 2 of them no longer live there. And they all said that they were very glad to have had a witness of those terrible years. Because, of course, you know, for them too, those years are now seen as a complete anomaly, and are an anomaly. They're in a completely different environment now. And so the book was published in Estonia, I should say, and you know, they were happy to see it. Other Estonians. So obviously the people involved, but I didn't realise it had been published in Estonian. Yeah.
So other Estonians, did they react kindly?
Yeah, it was very well reviewed, and
because people can be, you know, sensitive about foreigners coming and describing them.
You know, I think it was all right.
And I think one of the interesting things, which you get this hints throughout, that maybe you're not quite as anonymous a person as you seem to think you are. I mean, your family, Sigrid's family, created Tetra Pak, that's right, and so your name is quite well known. So actually there are these hints that actually, while you were observing them, they were quite definitely observing you.
Yeah.
You know, what do you think? What do you think the conclusions they came away with about the West? Do you think you helped them in that regard as sort of the part of the transition, just having someone there who was showing them what being European was? Because you have that they have this obsession with the word normal.
Yes.
You know, what is normal?
Yes.
Is something else. So the word normal had a different meaning to what we think of. It doesn't mean usual.
Yeah.
What's around us actually meant something entirely different.
Yeah, and that, I should say, it wasn't the case just for Estonia. Through the whole of the Soviet Union, still in Ukraine today, actually, you hear people say this is just not normal. And what they mean is this is not how things should be. You know, so normal in Estonia then and in Russia was about what, in Estonia it was particularly about Finland and Sweden. Finland and Sweden were normal, Estonia was not normal. You know, they knew that the situation was not normal. So they talked a lot about that. And about my identity, I remember there was and I describe it in the book, a few weeks in, somebody had put a clipping up in the teacher's room about some charitable donation my family had made. You know, and they put it up without saying anything to me about it, because Estonians are so habitually discreet. It's part of that remoteness, you know. and it's a wonderful part of it. And so I took the clipping down, and nobody ever mentioned it again.
No, do you think is that because they're Estonian and they don't mention things, or do you think they took the hint that this is something you didn't want to talk about?
I still don't really know. I think they thought things, but it was actually only when I was writing this book that I started to think more about how they saw me, and less about how I saw them.
And do you think, I mean, I started with that comment from your supervisor about anthropological fieldwork is not just studying your society and the society of which you have, sort of, as it were, embedded yourself, but also studying yourself. Do you think that this was, I don't know, is the word therapeutic? Do you think, do you think it did teach you about yourself, going and living in these such extreme circumstances?
I actually think it was deeply anti-therapeutic and actually quite potentially dangerous. And I think that because it's a very tough situation to put yourself in, not because of the material privations, but really because for all anthropologists, it's just very hard to put yourself, to embed yourself in another culture for such a long time. To remove yourself from everything that you know. And this, of course, was before email, before telephones, mobile phones. And so, now fieldwork itself is a different experience. Fieldworkers these days are never as removed as we were in my generation. Just as the generation before me were even more removed, but nevertheless, I think it maybe in the end made me stronger, but it was a tough experience too.
And do you so when I hadn't thought about this before, anthropologists, do you thereby have a sort of, as it were, a community of anthropologists who sort of can, you've all been through this?
Yeah, we've all been through this.
Yeah.
And of course the Africanists in that kind of discourse are always the toughest ones. The Africanists have a real swagger, Yeah. Anybody who's done European fieldwork is just so lame.
Do they look down on you a bit?
A little bit, a bit of that, yeah.
Is there anything in between? Is there,
Yeah, lots of things in between. All the Marxists are in Latin America, of course. Melanesia is, the sort of motherlode of anthropologists. That's, Melanesia as societies has been extensively studied.
And finally, I think we've got a couple of minutes before we go to questions. The title. I was going to start with this, but I thought it'd be funnier to end with it instead. You're describing a place which had significant, serious, at the time, apparently unresolvable problems, and you called your book "Everything is Wonderful." Why?
Well, I was in the spring. I gave a talk to some visiting diplomats, and it was a big group. It was the first time that the people in the village had heard my thoughts on the transition. And my thoughts were quite bleak, and I was talking about the history as well. And the headmistress of the school, who was married to the former boss of the collective farm, and who was widely, they were both widely seen as corrupt, and there were stories of theft the stories were basically that they had stolen and sold most of the assets, the few assets, I should add, of the collective farm. So they were very Soviet-minded still. And then the mayor in the village was very new and liberal and, kind of new mindset. And so she didn't like what I'd said. And I said to my neighbors, who by then had become friends, and they were teachers too. And I said to them, what should I have said? I didn't know what to say. And Allah said that everything is all right, that everything is wonderful. And he said it so ironically, and what he meant was that this was the Soviet way of describing reality. because the Soviet way of describing reality was always to talk it up and present the Potemkin facade. And so, he was being ironic about Linus' still, tendency to talk about the village in those terms.
Well, I think we have a quarter of an hour for questions. It would be nice if people had questions about the book. It might also be, I don't know, relevant on the day after the European elections to talk about Estonia as an astonishing achievement of the European Union, that it is no longer, as Sigrid describes, but is actually much more like Sweden. Could we have the lights up a bit, please, so we can see... Is there anyone there? Yes. Yeah, hello. So we could see you. And is there a microphone? Do we have microphones? Or yes, there is a lady in a yellow, and there's a gentleman here at the front. If he could have the microphone, please. Yes.
May I ask 2 questions, please? First is a personal one. The word poignancy permeates the discussion that you have had. Did you experience any moments of happiness and jollity when you were there? First, that's the personal question. The second question is, as we know, Stalin was responsible for moving large numbers of Soviet citizens into Estonia. I assume that most of them are still there. Does that throw up problems for the future?
I'll start with the second question. Yes, about a third of Estonia's population is Russian. There's a great distinction that people make in Estonia between the well-educated academic Russians who came and the working class Russians who were moved mostly to the eastern industrial parts of Estonia. And I think people in Estonia certainly feel that potentially there is a problem with, that population would be an easy one to mobilize for pro-Russian demonstrations, and it's something that Estonians worry about. In terms of my experience of being there, I had many happy times of being there, but the thing that really sustained me was walking in the forest, but there were happy times with informants, as well.
Sorry, I maybe gave an impression of it being overwhelmingly bleak. It does have
It was.
Yeah. Yes. Does anyone else have any? Yes, there is a lady over here, just to your left. Yes.
Hi, I run something called the All-War Prize, which Oliver often features on the long list of, so it's very nice.
Sadly not often, once.
No, you should. I just wanted to ask about whether, you've told a story about Estonia being better now. Do they teach their history better? Do they own... I thought the most extraordinary story was this incapacity to tell your own personal thing that just happened to you because you have no experience of telling a story about yourself that wasn't terribly dangerous. Is one of the things that has made Estonia better, or not, a better sense of their own history?
Yeah, and of course the Estonians had a very obvious political motivation for focusing on history, and the two presidents created what is now the Institute for Historical Memory, and all that research is online. You can see it, and but nevertheless, it was an important part of the transition for Estonia.
Yes, there is. If we could come over here to the front, there is a lady in fantastic trousers.
You described the barrenness, this absence of frame of reference. How do you think that people did cope psychologically, apart from drinking, in terms of the population that you were living within?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. Many didn't cope. So many people, life expectancy then was only, I think, 60.5 years for men, much higher for women. And that discrepancy was about alcohol mainly. And, there really was a sense in the countryside that they were hunkering down and enduring. Because also, what we haven't talked about was the Euphoria of Independence, which was the period basically between 89 and 91. There was a great deal of euphoria, the singing revolution. People were kind of finding themselves again in Estonia, and that euphoria had died down by the time I was there. So, yeah.
Just out of interest, how much of that euphoria would have been present there anyway? I mean, was this mainly Italian-based euphoria, or did it also extend to collective farms?
No, I think it was mainly Tallinn-based,
Right.
mainly town-based, I should say.
Right.
But it extended a bit, but not very much.
Right, okay. Yes, I think there's a lady there.
No, just a point I was going to make about history. I went to Tallinn a few years ago and visited the worst historical museum in the world.
The worst in the sense of the most depressing, or the worst, just the worst?
Just presentation, and it was ironic actually because it was Russian.
Oh.
It was evidently Russian. They spoke Russian. They acted like Russians, and it was very, very sort of strict. And also, it was just really rubbish. It was just medieval things that they'd found some tatty old costumes and scribbled a bit on. It was just very bad, basically. But anyway, that wasn't my main point. Just that lady saying that about history reminded me of this awful museum. Kieken de Kok, I think it was called. Anyway, sorry, I wanted to go back to the thing about the Swedish people. Can you just clarify how they got there, how long they were there, what sort of language are they using now? Why haven't they sustained their language? And will they sustain their culture?
They migrated down from Finland. This is the historical theory, because this is in the Middle Ages.
I mean, there are lots of Swedes in Finland at the moment, aren't there? So
Lots of Swedes in Finland. And the theory is that groups of Swedes migrated down to Estonia from there. And they did keep their language. And the language had developed into several very distinct dialects. And then in the Swedish revival after independence, in the schools and journals and so on, people were taught national Swedish, but they were also taught to appreciate the cultural value of their dialects. And so, they gained a degree of self-consciousness about who they were ethnographically at that time. And then, as I said, in 1944, they were evacuated by the SS back to Sweden.
But it should be said, in the 19th century, they'd sort of been living in really unimaginable squalor, hadn't they? And then some sort of Swedes from Sweden discovered them and made a project to sort of, as it were, Swedify them and stop them living in unimaginable squalor and start them being sort of forward-thinking Scandinavians.
There was a lot of that, which was actually a religious evangelical movement. But, it was very much about improving the living standards on this particular island. It didn't happen everywhere.
But it was a massive success, wasn't it? I mean, they went from being, miserable without even the wherewithal to build chimneys to being, extremely... Yes, anyway, yes, yay for that. There is a lady here with blonde hair, and...
How worried are you that Russia will invade the Balkan states following their invasion of Crimea?
Baltic,
sorry.
Yes.
I think it's very unlikely, and the reason I think it's unlikely is because of NATO. Because NATO then would be compelled to defend the Baltic states, legally compelled. Of course, it's not impossible. Edward Lucas, the journalist, wrote several years ago a scenario whereby that would happen, and NATO would kind of kick it into the long grass. But I don't think it's very likely.
It's possibly more likely that Mr. Putin would stir up the minorities to destabilize NATO without actually invading.
Well, that would be the beginning, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's cheerful times. I think there was a gentleman here. There's a gentleman here in a check shirt. Sorry, I'm telling you things about yourselves that you're not necessarily aware of.
On. Can you? Yes, that's better. I beg your pardon. You touched briefly on children. You spoke of the departed family of the alcoholic father and the corrupt head teacher. Would you like to talk a bit more about how children coped, what provision for education was there, and to the extent that you know, where are they now?
That's a very interesting question. The school where I was teaching had two parts, and one was the local village school up to grade 9, and the high school part had been in the Soviet era a specialized, language-orientated elite boarding high school. And so, the school was quite a well-known institution within Estonia. And there was quite a great distinction between the village kids and the high school kids. The high school kids were quite sophisticated. By the time I arrived there, it had been turned into a Swedish school to kind of link with the Swedishness of the area and with the twin town agreement with the Swedish town of Åtvidaberg. And so, I haven't followed any of the children that I taught and what happened to them. But I think they probably did quite well, They were interesting, intellectual kids, who were very eager to learn.
Yes, this gentleman here.
Sigrid, hi. I just wanted your musings about Russia and memory. Whenever I go there now, I get increasingly despondent at, under that nice Mr. P, and the partial or three-quarters rehabilitation of Stalin in schools, TV news being increasingly resembling a 21st century variant of what it was in Soviet times. And yet we have globalized communications and we have free travel for Russians. There seems to be quite an interesting challenge to populations whereby it is actually quite a lot easier to forget and not to want to remember. You don't actually need to be forced not to remember. There seems to be an increasingly tendency now in Russia to sort of say, that's enough memory, Ed. Apart from Memorial and other groups, there's sort of a desire to move on. What you think that is doing to the Russian psyche and the body politic?
I think it's very dangerous because, the loss of memory in Russia and the Soviet Union means that to Russians, every enemy of Russia is a fascist. And the anti-fascist struggle, and you can see this in the discourse about Ukraine in Russia, and the fact of the pain and the violence of the original anti-fascist struggle feeds into a struggle today which is no longer an anti-fascist struggle but can be described as that. And the reason it can be described as that is because Russia has been so very hazy about its own memorializing and so bad at for obvious political reasons, so bad at making the right distinctions and drawing the right conclusions from that. And so I think, you have a whole generation, and Putin is part of this, even though Putin himself is, well known for being particularly interested in history. The loss of history on a national scale, I think, is very dangerous in Russia, and particularly now with increasing authoritarianism. Memorial, which was an NGO, which was dedicated to give people the facts of the Gulag and Stalinism. It was also a human rights NGO, has folded. They wouldn't sign I'm sure you're all familiar with the foreign agents law that the Russians tried to implement. It's been a complete shambles. But Memorial was one of the NGOs that was particularly investigated after they refused to sign up as foreign agents, as all human rights organizations did. Nobody signed up. And they've now folded, as I said. It's a very sad state of affairs.
I think we've got time for one more question. There was a gentleman in a check shirt.
Thank you very much for your talk. Presumably, when you first went to Estonia, a collective farm, nobody owned anything. And in a few years, we've gone to a position, presumably, where houses are owned by people. And could you just comment on the mechanism by which this has happened?
Yeah, it's a very good question. When I was there, all the land was owned by a transitory commission. And so people then didn't know what was going to happen. And the law of former owners returning hadn't been finalized yet. In fact, former owners were entitled to get their land and their buildings back, and so that did happen. Most of the land on the collective farm has ended up as nature reserves. So there are now 3 large nature reserves on this peninsula. So, there is very little farmed land going on now in this particular place. I mean, the land was very poor, sandy soils. So, that seems to me a very good outcome for this particular place.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sigrid. My light has gone red. You can't see it. I can. Sigrid will be signing copies of her book, her wonderful book, Everything is Wonderful, in the bookshop, which I hope you all know where it is, because I can't, my geography is all that way, apparently. Anyway, you'll find it, follow the signs. I recommend it highly, and so I think just say thank you, Sigrid Rausing.
Thank you very much. Thank you.